Coin traders, how we doing? Thanks for joining me for the show. Looking at Algorand ALGO on that ticker. Been in a little period of sideways consolidation here as we do enter a little bit more consolidation type of a movement on the downside, unfortunately. So do have a little bit to talk about in the show today, especially as we do look to break these exponential moving average and hopefully break this trend, shift it back to the upside in favor of the bulls. But we know that there is still a lot of downside pressure on the overall crypto space, so that's something we're going to have to contend with as we do look forward with what these potential altcoins could be doing in the coming future here. Now, I want to start off and do something a little bit different and actually look at the 2-week chart first here, because specifically if we do zoom in on the recent pattern coming off of the fall rally, you can see a lot of upside movement, breaking the 26-period EMA, pulling back, testing the 12-period EMA, rallying up, seeing prices get barely above the 50-period EMA, but still holding a very big resistance zone in between this 50-period and 26-period. And then on the candle that we had that opened on the 8th of April here a few weeks ago, we had a huge pullback, and then we did close well below the 26 and the 12. But the exponential moving averages in this zone are extremely tight. As you can see, we're looking at the 26 and the 12 being almost next to each other. So didn't quite get a nice full bullish cross here, especially after slipping, and now after the last couple of weeks looking at losing these and holding them as closing level of resistance, as you can see by this giant massive wick that we had on the candle here that opened on the 22nd of April. So right now, EMAs are still very much in effect, especially the upper resistance zone at 50, but also reestablishing now the 12 and 26 as resistance, especially after backtesting both of these levels as support. You can see that we did have a little bit of shadows to the downside below this 12-period EMA, but a lot of dip buying did prevent closing below that level, and we did have algo bulls push prices back to the upside with a top out of 32.96. So if we actually zoom out here on this 2-week chart, do look left, and you can see how the 50-period EMA on this 2-week was pretty big, significant resistance. So we haven't had a chance to break it since we actually broke below back on the 17th of January, back in 2022 candle. So now on this 2-week candle, or this 2-week chart, you can see since holding resistance now after pulling back, confirming and backtesting resistance, just like we like backtesting support, we also backtest resistance in this instance. So that has been confirmed, which does mean the likelihood of a little bit more pullback. So on the 2-week chart, actually looking at a low come in for Algorand 16.55. So if we do see prices slip below that, then we will be looking at a little bit more downside. Otherwise, we have been looking at 2-week higher lows overall so far compared to the low that we saw on the pullback, 14.84. So slipping below 16.55 would actually see prices probably pushing down to test that 14.84 level. And then it will be up to the bulls whether or not we can defend support at that time and then see just a little bit of lower shadows. So realistically, it is going to come down to being able to hold the level of closing support at 16.35 here that we had the previous pullback on this 2-week chart. So our up, our down, our up, and then now actually need to hold a close on top of this level at 16.49, effectively 16.50. Now, pulling up the technicals here, one thing to note about this 2-week chart, specifically the stochastic RSI right now, is that once the stochastic RSI got to the upside, we actually smashed against the 100 line for the blue, rolled over, and then never significantly saw a huge retracement for this oscillator. We pretty much just saw barely breaking below the 80 line before rallying back to the upside. So this is the time now where we're actually looking at a little bit more of a pullback. So it is reasonable to think that we could see a little bit more impact on the price chart based on how the stochastic RSI is actually pulling back and cooling off. So zooming out, you can see that every single time we did get above the 80 line on this 2-week chart, we did have a little bit more of that pullback to the downside, but also in a bull market kicked off the EMAs. So since we still haven't fully broken the exponential moving average resistances yet for Algorand, still looking at a little bit more downside pressure as this oscillator does trend to the downside here. So if we are looking at a little bit more downside pressure and a test to this lower support level at 14.84, what happens if we actually break that, as we would be looking down to a test down in the 12-cent level, probably around 12.5 all the way up to about 12.9 cents, is going to be the next big major downside target that we would need to look at to hold before actually rallying down, or pushing down rather, into the upper 10 cent and then potentially down into the subs 10 cent levels. Flipping into the weekly chart here, and lots to talk about this as well. Obviously, you can see the exponential moving average is huge resistance to the upside, especially since they are super close. And the thing that's kind of interesting about the setup right now is that we actually don't have a bullish or bearish full setup yet, because we are looking at the 50-period EMA right in the middle of the 12-period on top, and then the 26 next on the bottom, since we haven't got that nice full bullish cross just yet for Algorand, since we did flip and actually, unfortunately, break a lot of the supports we were looking to hold. So weekly structure got completely blasted, and especially for the 3 weekly attempts that you saw, despite the long lower shadows on all of these weekly candles, we know that this isn't actually much of an upside move compared to this big, massive bearish week that we saw for Algorand here. So 3 weeks of upside with, interestingly enough, not that bad of volume, especially compared to what we actually saw for bearish volume. So the amount of bearish volume that we saw actually create that candle isn't as much, for example, as this tiny little bullish candle that we saw, despite this big upper wick that we saw on this candle. So pullback week, we're looking at 160.047 million for Algorand volume, and on the middle bullish week, looking at 178.537 million. So a lot more, still couldn't even punch up that much. But obviously, with a lot of the upside wicks and downside shadows, we know that a lot of indecision and competition between bulls and bears has been playing out, which is kind of why we do have a little bit more on that volume side. But now with the current candle, especially after back testing this resistance points on multiple weeks, looking at just over 2 days until we have a close, but the volume's extremely minimal. We're only looking at 40.065. So very small volume, but yet still we have a pretty big body on this weekly candle so far, but we're also pretty far away from the lows that we have seen on previous weeks. So for example, 10% pullback to the downside of 16.5, where we saw the previous week's low get to. So still plenty of opportunity to defend a weekly higher low in that instance, which would be the first step in actually pushing prices back to test where the exponential moving averages would fall and be that resistive point. Ultimately, if prices don't pick back up, we will end up seeing 50 periods staying on top, 26 pulling back, and then a full bearish cross continue once again. And then we will basically be in a setup like we were in the fall before we had the nice spring rally here. So now we'll look at technicals on the weekly, specifically just the RSI, because if we look at the levels of overbought, didn't have necessarily that much level of overbought, but if we look at previously where we have seen overbought levels, then even on the bull cycle here, still pulled back when we did have the RSI retrace from the overbought levels on this RSI down to below the 50 line, pretty much right around the 46, 45 line, which if we actually look left here on current, this is pretty much right where we're at right now with the current setup and the current RSI. Now, not to say that that's pretty much going to be a same play out and we're pretty much going to get another blast to the upside and see a new higher high, but what we need to know right now is that, especially since we are still kind of confirming resistances and path of least resistance now is to the downside, it is entirely possible we continue to see this RSI push down, just like we saw after the trend high that we had back in the fall of 2021. But so along with looking at the RSI, I also have to look at stochastic RSI right now, because we are still pretty far below the 20 line, especially after 2 months here of pullback. So every time we have had a big pullback here and seen the stochastic RSI below the 20 line, especially to this level, we have had ultimately a nice bullish cross and then a lot of upside direction here from that play out. So especially if we can see the RSI start to stabilize and start to see a nice bullish cross, that's what typically leads to a lot more bullish upside direction. Otherwise, we will probably start to hover and have a prolonged period of some action here down below the 20 line where we don't really see that much play out, and it kind of is stagnant for quite a while. But ultimately, we do know that when prices are still below, or the stochastic RSI is still below the 20 line, ultimately we will have to have at some point a nice bullish cross, and then that's when we see this oscillator provide a lot more upside positivity for the price action and movement for Algorand here. Flipping over into the daily chart now, and specifically looking at the last couple of weeks here, and if you notice that the volume on the upside after pulling back, setting a higher low here, actually started to decrease before getting rejected on this daily 26-period EMA. So overall taper off in bullish volume, taper off in price, confirming resistance. This is a very normal chart setup pattern. And then especially with 3 days of bearish downside action, still put in that higher low so far. And that's pretty much what we're looking at. And you can even see that we can draw a trend line right now that intersects as many of these candles as possible. That's what we want to do when we draw trend lines, is show the biggest points of relevance here. So since we have basically about a week's worth of candles backtesting and rejecting from this trend line, also have about 3 here on this backtesting instance. So right now on this current bearish pullback, need to see if we can defend. That's going to be our first bearish indicator number 1. If we do end up breaking this, then we will be looking down to the price low if we can defend that level. So again, the price level for that low, 16.55 cents. If we can do that, then we have another shot of actually reclaiming this trend line as support and then starting to see prices push back to the upside. So if that does not happen and we actually lose that price level, slip, find a lower low, then likely in that instance, we're going to put in a lower high because we're going to have the trend line as resistance and then also that big price level as resistance, which does mean a little bit more of that downside pressure coming in for certainty of pulling back and seeing lower prices there. So hopefully that little blip on the fundamentals of price levels and trend lines and how they function and pair together makes sense. If not, drop me a note in the comment sections below. Would be happy to try to explain it and provide a little bit more clarity and guidance to you. But otherwise, want to go ahead and look at the technicals here for the daily. And one of the things we've talked about here on the channel before is the relevance of the 50 line as a whole. So when the RSI can stay above the 50 line, that's a lot more of a bullish sign rather than when prices do get below, they typically start to tend to stay below that line. So in a very strong bull market, we'll see the RSI go from overbought levels, retracing down below the 70 line, but above the 50, and then back to overbought once again. So that's very normal to see in bullish markets. And then obviously in these type of pullbacks, very common to see these RSIs stuck below the 50 line and struggle to get back up, which is pretty much exactly where we are right now. So do need to see the RSI at some point get back above the 50 line. In that instance, typically we find a back test and confirm this level of support and then find our extension to overbought levels in that instance as well. So right now, especially looking at daily RSI for stochastic RSI, not really much we can deduce from here because we're not really seeing a lot of good indicators. And when we don't find indicators that are working, we invalidate them and we scrap them and don't really put any reliance on them. So that's exactly what we're doing in this instance with stochastic RSI on the daily, but obviously in the longer term charts, we're a lot more putting emphasis on a reliance for that indicator. So overall, I think for like a lot of other cryptos, the upcoming weeks and month might be a struggle and probably not a whole lot despite the last couple of months not really having much happen since we have seen our trend high in the middle of March here. So the last 2 months, obviously not much. Big pullbacks here, and like we talked about, Algorand pulling back here about 54-55%. Very normal and typical for a lot of altcoins right now, since that's pretty much the magnitude of pullback and retracement that we have seen. But we could obviously extend a little bit more and see a little bit more of that downside pressure as we do enter more of the summer months here. But as always, would love to know everyone's thoughts, issues, predictions, disagreements, all that stuff down in the comments sections below, or feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or X as well. And for that, @coin_trades is the handle over there. Looking forward to chatting with everyone over on Twitter or X. That is going to wrap it up for now, though. So make sure you hit the thumbs up, like, and subscribe if you have not done so just yet. Do appreciate all the continued love and support. As always, it does mean so much. Stay safe, take care, coin traders, and I'll catch you back in the next video. Peace.